He asked, where did the Irgun get its weapons from? Irgun was one of those paramilitary organizations, they're called, that were terrorists. They just killed Palestinian civilians and other people, and the British. Mostly, I believe at that time, from the US. Now later, Zionist forces also got a lot of weaponry from Czechoslovakia, but the Irgun was funneling, there were a number of groups in the US, and again, it's all in my book, just because luckily there are excellent books that had done the original primary research. But there were a number of groups, businessmen around the US were meeting and setting this up and getting, sending over major weaponry to these groups. The question was about both Jewish and non-Jewish banking people and what was their relation to Zionism, in particular the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, I think. I didn't specifically research that part, but I didn't come across Rockefeller connections that I recall. Maybe I'm forgetting something, but I don't remember seeing that. Now, the Rothschilds I did see. Originally, they had not really been in favor of Zionism. So, the idea that they're behind all of this, I don't find likely, because they didn't seem to be in favor of it at first, but then they did come around, and then they did fund some activities in Palestine, some Zionist activities. I don't know, I didn't do the, someone else could do this research, so I don't know the quantity of money and this percentage of money and that sort of thing. But there definitely was a connection.
May I interrupt just for a second?
Oh, and one more thing. Let me just finish this. The Balfour Declaration was written to Lord Rothschild. So by that time, that was 1917. They were, of course, fully Zionists. So that's often left out, too. This was, by the way, it's called the Balfour Declaration because the foreign minister was Lord Balfour. But he actually didn't write it. It had actually been written by a different person, and the text had gone back and forth between Zionists in the US and Zionists in Britain. And then they wrote this as a letter to Lord Rothschild. The father of Zionism was named Theodor Herzl. And he wrote a book about this, in fact, a few books. And it was a response to anti-Semitism, that the idea was that we have to have our own country where we will be safe and there won't be, we'll have our own country. But the thing that's interesting is that worldwide, fellow Jews did not feel that way. They did not embrace it at all. And many in England said, we're English. We don't want another country somewhere. Many Americans said, we're Americans. In fact, the Zionists complained about that the people that, Jewish Americans were too, American. So, but that was the rationale. And
the real reason was no real reason?
Yeah, is there a reason behind that? I think that was his thinking. And the thing that's interesting about him is he was willing to take something else. They considered Uganda. The British actually offered them Uganda. And the other Zionists didn't want to take that. Largely, it was not a religious movement. And again, the religious Jews also, the large majority, considered it heretical. I mean, there were some exceptions, and that changed over the years, but there's still some like that. But, it was a great sales point. This is our homeland, and as we hear people repeating that today, but that's not the way the Jews felt that then. They didn't feel it was their homeland. 2,000 years before, and there's a real question about how much European Jewish ancestry actually even goes back there. So, that's a very good question. Did everybody here in the back hear the question? Basically, what happened to the U.S. media? Why aren't journalists doing what we are supposed to do on this? I think that is a key question. And I think there are, again, a number of factors. Some questions are quick answers. This is one that there are a number of factors. And that should be studied extensively, et cetera. But the first thing is to even discuss them, which almost nobody does. So one, of course, is sometimes advertising pressure and consumer pressure. So the Zionist organizations in the U.S. are very, very active. They have massive budgets, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars when you combine them. We're trying to add them up now, and it's just astronomical. So many they can orchestrate large boycotts, which they've done against the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, Boston NPR affiliate, that were places that were already pro-Israel, but they had deviated a bit. Maybe they told something about Gaza or something, So they've often orchestrated boycotts and advertisers threatening to pull ads and pulling ads. So sometimes there's that kind of economic pressure. And the rest of the people not even aware, not weighing in at all. That's one factor. Some owners are clearly pro-Israel. Mortimer Zuckerman, who has owned a number of major media, I think now he owns, it's the New York Post, used to own the Atlantic. He's very pro-Israeli, and he makes it pretty clear to his staffs what he wants and what he doesn't want, and what's going to get them promoted, etc. So I think ownership sometimes no doubt plays a role if somebody feels strongly. Sometimes within the editorial process, there's a reporter on the scene, then there's an editor back in the U.S., and I sometimes meet with the foreign editors, and in meeting with them and talking with them, it comes fairly clearly that they've been conditioned as Zionists. So I think sometimes it's right at that level. The owner might not know or care, the editor might not know or care. That's going on. There are a number of majors, Wolf Blitzer, who's the anchor of CNN, used to work for the Israel lobby. That's going on. Then just a little bit more to this that's very interesting is that the oldest and largest wire service in the world, and I assume that your papers use this a lot, is the Associated Press, AP. Well, AP, the way it works is in all regions, there'll be a few bureaus, and then one of the bureaus is designated a control bureau, sort of for bureaucratic reasons. So rather than all these bureaus sending things out, they get coordinated, they send them into the main bureau, and that main bureau sends them out, or doesn't. Rewrites them, edits them however they want. So with this case, AP won't answer my questions, but as near as I can tell, there are 2 bureaus in Israel. These are staffed largely, it used to be, I think, at times exclusively, but I think that's changed a bit, but pretty much always by Jewish and or specifically Israeli journalists, which is good because then they'd be plugged in and get the stories and know what's going on. In the occupied territories, they also had a bureau in the West Bank and in Gaza. I was in the bureau in the West Bank. That's where I learned a lot of this. And they are similarly staffed largely by Palestinians, Christian and Muslim, which is good. They'll know the language, be plugged in. So why are we getting 7 times more reports on Israeli children than on Palestinian children, which we discovered was going on? Well, then I discovered there was this control bureau system, and it is one of the ones in Israel. So when you see, now again, I've been writing about this and speaking about this for probably at least 5 years, and I like to think maybe that's caused some modification, but it would be when you would see a byline from somebody, usually there aren't even bylines, but if there's a byline and you saw what sounded like a Palestinian name, Arab name, and maybe the date line Nablus, which is the West Bank, he didn't write it and it wasn't written in Nablus. He phoned it in to West Jerusalem, to this big building where all the media have their headquarters, which is in Israel, and an editor there wrote the article and put in the context they decided to, thousands of rockets, and left out the context they didn't want. I was in the West Bank when I think a boy was 9 or was around the age of 10 years old, when I was at the bureau in the West Bank. And that's where I was interviewing, asking how does your process work? And he got a phone call while I was there in front of his desk, and he took the phone call, and then he phoned it in to the control bureau, and he told me what it had said, that a little boy, and I've got the picture here somewhere, but I don't think you want to see it. It said this boy had been killed, shot in the throat. And the boy there'd been one of these armored Israeli patrols that come into the West Bank and Gaza every day. These invasions that we think happen every few years, actually small ones happen every day. So they were there. He was throwing stones against them from 300 meters away. And, of course, the stones were not even, were falling far short. And they shot and killed him. So that's what he called into them. When I got back to the U.S., I went to the library and used LexisNexis to see what AP had written. No news story. Now imagine if that had been an Israeli child. And I kept searching, and there was a mention that a boy had been killed that day. A boy had been killed that day in a clash. I'll sort of address two, because I think part of what you were saying is, how can Israel be this bad? How can they be like that? And which is, of course, how it is shocking, enormously shocking. But when you read about the inculcation that's done with Israeli children from young ages, Nuret Peled, who's an Israeli academic, wrote an excellent book. I haven't read her book yet, but I met her and heard her presentation in Israel about the textbooks, what's being taught to children from the earliest ages all the way through school. So there's a massive propaganda from very young ages of nationalistic and paranoid, and that whole thing is going on. The media, I just read a very good article that the Israeli media are not showing much of what's going on. So even though we're seeing this much more than they are. So I think that was interesting to see. I think maybe it was Gideon Levy that wrote that. So some Israeli journalists have done an excellent job of writing some of this. Also, though, some Israelis who are very against what their government is doing will say it's a choice not to know at the same time, because there is supposed to be 100% draft, military service. And even though it's not 100%, it's a very high percentage of people who have been in the military themselves, or their brother has, or their husband, or their sister. So it's a combination of a lot of factors. That's how you get people to do these things. Now, in terms of the media coverage now, I've been doing a lot of things, which means I'm not always following the media as much as some people might have seen all the CNN, but I haven't, because I'm trying to add up numbers and things. But some of what I'm seeing is some more maybe getting out. Each time some of this gets out, and people are seeing a major massacre, and more people are thinking, wow, Israel's really overdoing it, So every time I think some more Americans are waking up to what's going on, but they do consistently spin it as, like, for example, even just the phrasing of the beginning of the newscast will be Israel against Hamas. And it's, when there are 1,000 people killed in schools, but that's how it's framed. So it's framed, they've been trading attacks. One has probably the 4th or 5th most powerful military in the world. And the other has no air force, no army, no navy, no marine, But they're trading attacks. So they keep framing it the best it seems to me that there are people there framing it the best they possibly can in Israel's favor. I'm sure there are others doing their very best to get it out. But that framing keeps going on. But more is getting out. With the internet now, if you want to keep your credibility, and of course lots of newspapers are failing, you have to, as other young people mainly go to the internet, etc. So as everybody's learned more, they're having to do a little bit better and be a bit better. That's actually not the case. That the thing that's interesting is that's one reason about my research that was so interesting. Because again, you see what's interesting, a lot of the information, in many cases, as you see, from Sarah Schmidt, for example, and even Peter Gross, who wasn't Jewish or Israeli, but he definitely tilted towards Israel. Definitely wasn't tilting in that direction. But a lot of times these authors, especially the ones that are Zionists, reveal a lot. They have a lot of valuable information in their books. And Wolf Blitzer wrote a book where he wrote that originally the amount of money that the U.S. gave Israel, which was substantial, was because of guilt. It was the moral reason because of the Holocaust and sympathy for the Jewish people, without being aware that this meant a new injustice, a new refugees, a new genocide, a new slow genocide this time. And but so he wrote that. But then, after several decades of that, and after the money went up so much more, which happened in the late 60s and then early 70s, that he wrote, people will only give that out of that motivation for so long. Israel realized that Americans needed to think this was in their self-interest. They started some think tanks, they wrote some academic papers. Zionists loved picking that up. well, it's our ally in the Middle East. It's our, the only democracy in the Middle East, even though it has no constitution. So, you plant that, and again, you've got multi-million-dollar organizations to go around planting that everywhere. Now certainly sometimes the U.S. establishment has made use of Israel to do some of our dirty work in Central America, some places like that. So it's never 100%. But if you look at what the U.S. gains from this, in the way that maybe not I would consider it, but the way somebody in the Pentagon might consider it, what the U.S. gains compared to what we lose, it's just massively, we lose much, much more. Yeah, well, first of all, about that, I haven't seen that 93% before, so I'm very suspicious of the ADL numbers. They find anti-Semitism everywhere, because the more they find, the more they create the bigger, Abe Foxman gets like $750,000 salary. So he's the head of the ADL, Abe Foxman. So they're in the business of finding anti-Semitism. And when you look at what they consider anti-Semitism, it's very often not what I would call bigotry. So again, I don't know if that number is correct or not. But yes, the ADL has a number of pages about me. And when I saw them, I wrote them a letter. I tried to call them. I couldn't get through. So I tried to email them and didn't get a response. And I wrote a letter and put it on my blog. And now they say that I did that. But what's interesting is what they say I had written in articles. Now normally what you do in this day and age in the internet is you link to the article. You may have noticed they don't do that. Because if you go to the article and read it, it's not what they say. So, they misportray people. They've named me my two organizations are in the top 10 anti-Israel organizations. And they have someplace on at least their old website, they had the top 5 anti-Israel people, and I was one of them, the only non-Arab. So I don't know if that was affirmative action or something for me, but it's actually, in a sense, it's humorous, because sometimes you just have to laugh at absurdity, and sometimes we'd rather laugh than cry. But as we know, it's a very, very bad thing for 2 reasons. One is that some people still believe that. So there is the chance that I'll be invited someplace like this, and the cautious owner of the building or the dean of the college or something will go online and say, oh, the ADL says she's anti-Israel, she's bordering anti-Semitic, and not allow it. So, it's a very powerful organization, and that's what goes on. Also, of course, it's crying wolf too often, because sometimes there is anti-Semitism. But many of us now, when we hear somebody who's anti-Semitic, I roll my eyes. And it is not good to cry wolf too often, and that's what they're doing. There definitely was collaboration between Zionist leaders and the Nazis. There are quite a few books about it, mostly, in fact, all of the ones I can think of offhand are by Jewish authors. It was a scandal when it came out in Israel. There was, I think, a docudrama about it at one point. It caused one Israeli government to fall. Now, it wasn't quite as bad as I think you were sort of saying, that they collaborated to make them do these things, but they did collaborate with them, and people, I go into this in my book a bit, and have the citations of the other books that write about it in detail. But it definitely happened, and was widely known. And the thing that's also strange, and that's not in those books, but this whole Balfour thing in World War I is that the Zionists afterwards wrote, one of the leaders, Samuel Landsman, wrote an article in a Zionist publication. They were angry in the 30s because the British weren't opening up immigration enough, they felt, And so, even though they were very brutal against the Arabs, but they didn't feel they were brutal enough, and they weren't opening enough immigration. So he wrote this sort of letter or article, basically to the British, saying, you have an obligation to us to let us go to Palestine, because the animosity among the Nazis is partly because they know we helped the U.S. get into the war. So that's what caused the Nazis to act the way they do. It's a paraphrase of what he wrote, but in my book are the actual words, and you can go to the actual source. It's even so there was, this kind of collaboration, this kind of very weird connection. There was also sabotage of rescue efforts during the war that were, they intentionally sabotaged it. And Ben-Gurion made a famous statement. Well, it should be famous. Most people haven't heard it, but if I could save all of the Jewish children of Europe but not have a Jewish state in Palestine, or if I could save half and have a Jewish state, I would save half. So it's very fanatic. It was a very fanatic movement. That's a very good question because it's become increasingly significant. It's, by the way, there are some organizations that are specifically fundamentalist Christian that are very pro-Palestinian and are specifically working to reach that group. There's an excellent documentary by a man named Porter Speakman, and they also had a conference called Christ at the Checkpoint, put it on I think, at Bethlehem Bible College, that was specifically targeting fundamentalist evangelical Christians. So there's some very interesting movement in that. I have some things in my book, and they, again, direct you to where you can do more research, but the thing about this Christian Zionism is that it has been around for quite a while. I think it was James Darby or somebody in England sort of came up with this dispensationalist kind of theology. But it was not mainstream. It wasn't the majority of Christians. It began to grow when political Zionism took, place. And then with when Israel came into position, somebody, for example, what's his name? Jerry Falwell. Well, one reason he became such a celebrity is he was bought a jet plane by Israel. So you see, you've got Jerry Falwell, who's, charismatic, apparently, fundamentalist evangelical Christian, with a jet plane to teach all the Jews should go to Israel, we should support Israel, if you curse Israel, God will curse you, etc. And you've got Ted Pike, I think is his name, fundamentalist, right-wing Christian, charismatic, one of the people who started the National Prayer Day or something, very pro-Palestinian, saying this is not what the Bible says, this is not what the New Testament says, this is an incorrect interpretation, very, scripture, chapter and verse, he goes through it. No jet plane, no money for radio programs, etc. So I think, that plays a big role. Plus, so I think that's a very big role. You've also got the media do affect people. I still think, even with that kind of thinking, I found that when you learn what's going on with Palestinians, it's not too hard to say to somebody, well, even if that's what you think is meant to be, is this the way it would happen? Is this what Jesus taught? Wouldn't it be like in God's time, maybe in 1,000 years or something? If they were seeing that every day, I don't think it would take the kind of hold that it does when the media reinforce it, especially the conservative media. And then also, that what was very interesting is one of the things that helped spread that is this Bible called the Scofield Reference Bible. I had never seen it, but apparently it's widely used in some denominations and in the Bible schools of those denominations where people become ministers. And it's a Bible where you have the words in the middle, and then some places there are explanations for what they mean. And the explanations make it seem like you should support Israel, that all the Jews have to go there, etc. And the man who wrote it was Cyrus Scofield, who was an American. He was he sort of had a sketchy background. He'd abandoned his children and his wife, and he'd gone to another place and become a preacher. And then at a point in his life, but a fairly successful one, but then at a point in his life, there's a biography of him. He's in New York, in Manhattan, and he's a member of a literary club called the Lotus Club. Not the usual match you would see. And his reference Bible is published by the Oxford University Press. Not the usual connection you expect a Texas preacher to have. So others, this biographer and others have read that they think somebody else was helping Schofield along. And some have suggested that at the same time that he was a member of the Lotus Club was Samuel Untermeyer, who was a very prominent Zionist lawyer in New York, and one of the first, I think, to ever win $1 million case or something. Very prominent Zionist, worked a lot for Zionism, was a member at the same time, so they wonder if Untermeyer might have been that. So I have this not in the main body of my book, I just have it in the footnote that people might want to look into. There are a lot of different groups in Israel that are opposing the Israeli government. They go from, unfortunately it's a small percentage, and especially electorally, but there are quite a few different ones, and they range from being very anti-Zionist and saying this should be a free society with equal rights for all people without discrimination whatsoever, and others that are still somewhat Zionist, but definitely don't want massacres, don't want cruelty, don't want the humiliation that goes on at checkpoints. So there are some of the names that I can happen to remember right now are just random ones, but there's Maxim Watch, which is these women that go to the checkpoints, often my kind of age, that go there for these young soldiers to have somebody that's like their mother or their grandmother there, making sure that they will treat people with respect and fairly. So that's real commitment of time and energy and effort. There's Rabbis for Human Rights. There are Israelis against torture. There are Israelis against home demolitions. There's the Shemistin, I think it's called, young people that are refusing to go into the military. There are refusers who are refusing to take part in the military. There are, I've forgotten, some newer groups are specifically anti-Zionist. And I wish I could remember their names because they are especially taking strong positions and sometimes going around and speaking, around outside of Israel as well. So there are really quite a few that are trying to do that. And it's a very difficult place to do it.
Yeah.
So I hope you'll read my book and tell other people about it, because it'll take all of us to share this information. Thank you.